How I regret now that we started talking about science fiction that evening. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't still be tormented by this strange, incredible story that can neither be proven nor disproven. That evening, 4 of us, professional science fiction writers, gathered together, and I think a serious discussion was inevitable under any circumstances, and yet we managed to avoid it throughout dinner. Madison animatedly told us about his hunting trip, while Brazel started a discussion about Dodgers' chances in the upcoming election. And then, somehow, I shifted the conversation to science fiction. I hadn't intended to. But suddenly, it struck me as amusing how our behavior was no different from that of ordinary, unremarkable people. Camouflage, that's what it is, I declared. Here we are, sitting and trying to look just like everyone else. Brazel looked at me, slightly annoyed at being interrupted. What are you talking about? About us, I replied. We're doing a great job playing the role of respectable, content city dwellers. But that's not who we really are, and we all know it. We are actively dissatisfied with what's happening on Earth and around us. That's why we create one imaginary world after another, and the little detail that we get paid for it has nothing to do with it. Of course, Brazel remarked sarcastically. No, why not? I agreed. But we were inventing the most incredible worlds and people long before we got a single word published. Isn't that right? Even when we were children, and all because we don't feel at home on Earth? Madison snorted. I doubt we'd feel any better on the planets we've imagined. That's when Garrick, the 4th in our group, joined the conversation. He had always behaved somewhat strangely. We didn't know him very well, but we liked him and admired his stories. One series in particular had been a masterpiece, a detailed depiction of an imaginary planet. It happened to me, he said to Madison. What happened to you? Madison asked. Exactly what you just suggested. I once wrote about an imaginary planet, and then I had to live on it, Garrick replied. Madison laughed. I hope it was better than the bleak worlds that keep creeping into my mind. But Garrick didn't even smile. I would have changed a lot, he muttered. If I had known I would have to live there someday. Brazel winked at us and then, without overcomplicating things, said, We're listening, Garrick. Garrick began his story slowly, pausing every few words. It happened after I moved into a house near a power station. At first glance, it might seem like an inconvenient location, but in reality, it was completely silent on the outskirts of the city, and I needed that silence to write. I immediately started working on a new series of stories, set on the same imaginary planet. I began with a detailed physical description of the world and the universe it was in. I was so deeply immersed in my work that I noticed nothing around me. And then, when I finished writing, something clicked in my brain. It was a brief and incredibly strange sensation, one that reminded me of crystallization. I froze, thinking I was losing my mind. Because suddenly, I had an unshakable feeling that the universe and the world I had been writing about had crystallized and come into physical existence. Of course, I dismissed the absurd thought and went outside, soon forgetting all about it. But the next day, the same thing happened again. I was working on the inhabitants of my imaginary planet. I made them human, but chose to avoid high civilization. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to create the conflicts necessary for my story. So I created my imaginary world with semi-civilized people. I described their brutality and prejudices. I envisioned their colorful yet tasteless cities. And as soon as I put my pen down, that clicking sensation happened in my brain again. This time I was deeply disturbed. My conviction grew even stronger. What I had been writing about so intently was becoming real. I tried to think logically, to convince myself otherwise. If I had truly created a real world and universe, then where were they located? Certainly not in the space around me. There couldn't be 2 entirely different universes coexisting there. But maybe my imagination had made them real in some uninhabited, empty part of the cosmos, or in another dimension, in a space where free atoms and chaotic matter had taken shape under the force of my concentrated thoughts. I speculated wildly, applying logic to something that shouldn't exist. Why had my fantasies never become real before? Well, that was explainable after all. There was a powerful power station nearby. Some minuscule, undetectable energy leakage could have been focusing my thoughts, transmitting them into empty space, where matter took form according to my imagination. Did I believe this explanation? No, I didn't. I simply knew it was true. I understood that it was impossible, that my imagination could not have created a real universe in another dimension of space, and yet I was absolutely certain that it had. A funny thought occurred to me. I wondered, what if I imagined myself in that other world? I immediately sat down and created an entire identity for myself as one of the millions of inhabitants of my fictional world. I gave myself a family, a whole lineage, a detailed life story up to the present moment. And then, click. Garrick fell silent, staring at the empty cup he was slowly turning in his hands. Madison prompted him. And then, of course, you woke up, saw a beautiful girl leaning over you and asked, "Where am I?" "No, not quite," Garrick replied dully. "Not at all. I did find myself in that other world, yes. But it wasn't like waking up. I was simply there. I was still myself, but the version I had imagined. That other me had always lived there, just like his many ancestors. Remember, I had been very thorough in my creation. And in that imagined world, I was just as real as I am in this one. It was awful. The planet and its low level of civilization were painfully real." He fell silent again. At first I felt strange. I walked through the streets of those garish, tasteless cities, looked into people's faces, and wanted to shout, "I invented you all! If not for my imagination, you wouldn't exist." But I stayed quiet. No one would have believed me. To them, I was just an insignificant, ordinary person, one of many. How could they possibly know that their traditions, their history, their world, and their universe had suddenly been created by my mind? Once my initial excitement faded, I realized I didn't like it there. The conflicts and brutality that had seemed so compelling on paper were ugly and unpleasant in reality. All I wanted was to return to my own world, and I couldn't. I simply didn't know how. I thought of imagining myself back home, but it didn't work. That mysterious energy that had created the miracle only worked one way. I won't describe how miserable I was when I realized I was forever trapped on that grim, semi-civilized planet. At first I even wanted to end my life, but I didn't, because people can adapt to anything, and I adapted. "So what did you do there? I mean, what was your profession?" Brazel asked. Garrick shrugged. "I wasn't familiar with their technology or trades, but I did know how to do one thing right." I couldn't help but smile. "Are you saying you became a science fiction writer?" He nodded seriously. What else could I do? I knew nothing else. So I started writing about my real world. To everyone else, my stories were fantastic fiction, and they were successful. We laughed. But Garrick remained deadly serious. Madison decided to play along to the end. "So how did you finally return from that world you created?" "I didn't," Garrick said with a heavy sigh. "Oh, come on," Madison protested cheerfully. "Obviously you did." Garrick solemnly shook his head and rose from his chair, preparing to leave. "No," he said sadly, "I'm still there.